We've just got some news in. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that Gaza City is now encircled. Let's listen to a clip of what he said.
Gaza City is encircled. We are operating inside it. We are increasing pressure on Hamas every hour, every day. We have killed thousands of terrorists above and below ground. There will be no ceasefire without the release of our hostages.
Well, for more, we can cross now to Rob Pinfold, who is a lecturer in peace and security in the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University in the UK. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Just picking up on what the Israeli Prime Minister was saying there, and also the news that Israeli troops are now right in the heart of Gaza City. How significant would you say that is?
Well, this is very significant, Tom, because Israel didn't know exactly how to conduct its ground invasion at the start of this campaign. One of the reasons why it took so long to get going with that invasion, longer than many pundits predicted, is because there was a real dissensus at the heart of Israel's government about how to conduct a ground campaign. There now seems to be a consensus crystallizing around a longer campaign than the Israeli Defense Forces initially envisioned, basically surrounding Gaza City, surrounding other urban areas within the Gaza Strip to basically try and starve Hamas out, rather than getting stuck and bogged down in those urban areas where the fighting is likely to be the most intense and the casualties highest. Israel is basically now playing this long game. This is something that Israel hasn't normally done before. In previous campaigns, they've favoured short, sharp, decisive campaigns simply because the Israeli economy doesn't cope very well with long, drawn-out military campaigns, and indeed international criticism tends to escalate on the other hand. So this is really new territory for Israel, though thus far it does seem to be yielding military gains at least.
Yeah, we were just listening to our correspondent who spoke to me a bit earlier on. We just had a clip of her interview before we crossed to you. And she said that the troops there, according to her sources, aren't meeting a huge amount of resistance. Presumably there's a huge labyrinth of tunnels, or we know there's a labyrinth of tunnels under Gaza City. And I'm just wondering, how do you win a tunnel war? And, could this be a trap, the fact that the Israeli troops are not facing the sort of resistance that perhaps you might expect them to?
I think it's inevitable that Hamas would readjust its own tactics. Hamas was, all the suggestions are that Hamas was expecting a sort of shock and awe attack by Israel that would mean there'd be very intense close quarters fighting. So it's now recalibrating its tactics. It makes sense for it operationally to try and preserve its fighters because it knows that this is a long haul campaign. But Israel is basically banking on being able to win this war without fighting that tunnel war that you describe, basically letting Hamas and its fighters sit there in those tunnels and to try and starve them out, to deprive them of logistical support, to deprive them of fuel, electricity and water that would eventually then force a Hamas capitulation. Israel's already evacuated as many civilians as it can from the northern Gaza City area, and obviously those airstrikes have been more comprehensive than any airstrikes in Israeli history towards the Gaza Strip. So the urban landscape has changed, but Israel's goal to try and avoid getting drawn into that tunnel warfare, which really would be something completely unprecedented in the history of modern warfare, Israel's goal to remain outside of that close quarters tunnels warfare remains unchanged.
But likely to be in those tunnels, I mean, we can't speculate too much, but it's possible or probable that at least some of the 240 or so hostages are in there. And I'm just wondering to what extent Israel's allowing the hostage dimension to dictate its course of action here.
This is a nightmare dilemma for Israeli policymakers. Israel's policymakers face significant public pressure to basically to prioritise the release of those hostages unharmed. Now, I should note that we don't know how many of those hostages are still alive. Yes, we know that 240 people were taken into the Gaza Strip, but previously when Israel's rivals like Hamas and Hezbollah have taken hostages in the past, it's often then later transpired that many of those hostages died either in the aftermath of the kidnapping attempt or in the kidnapping itself. So Israel probably doesn't have accurate numbers on how many of those 240 hostages are alive, but that adds to its security and operational dilemmas in waging any kind of tunnel warfare, which is another reason why Israel would rather basically sit it out, just try and force Hamas's hand, try and force them to capitulate and arrive at a political solution, rather than endangering not just IDF soldiers, but also those Israeli hostages through tunnel fighting and tunnel warfare.
And as well as obviously trying to starve out the Hamas militants underground, I mean, there are, of course, 2.3 million civilians who live in the Gaza Strip who've been under siege for a month now, under aerial bombardment for a month now. I'm just wondering whether perhaps Israel had calculated on at some point the ordeal that those 2 million people are going through would perhaps make them turn on their Hamas rulers. Do you think that was something that Israel thought would happen? And do you think that it is happening? Are there any signs that that's happening, that there's any kind of sense of discontent amongst people in Gaza, that this has got to stop and actually we're going to start shifting the blame towards Hamas for starting this in the first place?
I think it's too early to tell from the current crisis, Tom, simply because, there's no, obviously, for obvious reasons, there's no polls of Palestinian public opinion being taken at the moment when such a dramatic and dynamic military situation is unfolding in the Gaza Strip. Nevertheless, Israel has tried this in the past. In southern Lebanon, for example, Israel has tried to basically squeeze Lebanon's government and civilian infrastructure in order to put pressure on Hezbollah. On several occasions in the 90s and indeed in 2006, the last Israel-Hezbollah confrontation, there is no evidence that that has ever worked. At the end of the day, if people find their water, electricity, communications cut off by Israel, they tend to blame Israel, not focus their anger on Israel's local rivals. So if Israel is looking to do that, it's unlikely to succeed, though it's early days and we can't tell at the moment exactly how Gaza's civilian population are responding and if there's been any changes in public opinion as a result of the latest escalation.
OK, and Rob, just one last question before we let you go. It's been a month, obviously, today since the Hamas attacks on Israel and roughly a month as well since the Gaza offensive began. Are we any closer, do you think, 1 month into this conflict to other regional powers being drawn in? Where are we on that score, do you think?
I think at the moment it's still a tightrope and a balancing act that both Iran and the United States and its, Arab allies are trying to walk. Yes, Iran wants to show Hamas that it's being as supportive as possible. That's why you see, for example, some of those limited long-range missiles being fired at from the Houthis in Yemen. That's why you see constant flare-ups and tension on the northern border between Israel and Hezbollah. At the same time, Iran does not want to sacrifice all of its assets. It doesn't want to put all of its eggs in one basket here. It doesn't want to end up with a situation where it's not only lost Hamas as an asset, but also Hezbollah in the north and possibly even the Houthis as a result of a US intervention should there be an escalation. So I think at the moment, neither side, neither Israel, the US and those so-called moderate Arab states on the one hand, nor Iran and the so-called axis of resistance on the other, want this to escalate and expand beyond the Gaza Strip. But all it takes is one missile attack that claims significant casualties, one accidental escalation like that, and then that can set the whole region aflame. So it's really impossible to tell whether we're out of the woods yet. Anything could still happen. Yeah,
indeed. OK, well, really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, Rob Pinfold, lecturer at the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.